Hello, my name is Susan Curtis. I am a professor of History and American Studies at Purdue University. I did my graduate work at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. And today I'd like to talk about some of my work, which is an interdisciplinary approach to art that helps us think about issues of social justice. As a member of the faculty at Purdue University, I have many colleagues in the sciences and in agriculture and in nursing, for example, who work on research projects that make a huge difference in the real world, from addressing issues of hunger and health to addressing issues of the environment. And as a humanist, a humanistic scholar, I often felt like there wasn't any kind of a contribution that I could make. But that changed when I began studying the work of Scott Joplin, who was an African-American musician. I actually first encountered his work as a youngster, I won't say how many years ago, when I heard his music as the soundtrack for a very fun movie called The Sting. And I thought it was the most beautiful music. I had no idea of the history of the person. In 1991, I began studying his work very systematically. And what I discovered is that this is music that has to be understood from an interdisciplinary perspective. In fact, when I first told colleagues that I was going to study this extraordinary African-American composer, he was, after all, the composer of 2 operas, a ballet, and many different pieces of dance music. They said, well, where are the Scott Joplin papers? And I said, well, there aren't any. And my colleagues universally said, well, then you can't do this project. So, of course, I ignored them. And I went ahead and did what I had planned to do, to see what I could find out about the life of this extraordinary man. And that meant poring over newspapers and reading handwritten census documents and so on, and looking at his music itself to see what made this man important. But in the end, what I discovered is that there were so many blank spaces in his life that I had to look for something else. And I thought what would make sense is to figure out what the music meant, how it was received in its time. I was surprised to learn that there were 2 responses. One was enthusiasm and support, and the other was utter rejection. The first group saw Joplin's music as a form of liberation, and that was a term that was used, and the other group saw it as a form of barbarian music. And so I listened again and again to compositions by Scott Joplin, and to be honest, I couldn't hear either the liberation or the barbarian quality. And so I thought, well, I have to understand more deeply. The music itself wouldn't tell me the answer. And so I began thinking about the context. Scott Joplin was an African-American man who was born right after the end of our Civil War, which brought the institution of slavery to an end. But his parents had been slaves. And so here was a man who produced operas in a time when many Americans felt that African-descended people did not have the capacity, the talent, the intelligence, or the ability to produce music of the highest Western standards. And yet here was a man who did so. What I think I began to understand is that people were offended by the fact that this man's work showed that they didn't understand the truth. They didn't understand the truth about what capacity African-American musicians had. Scott Joplin faced this stereotypical treatment in his own life. I found that some of his early compositions, which were published by the people he could get to publish them, his publishers didn't take him seriously and portrayed him as a rag picker and indicated that someone else had to write the music. And yet, within a few years, his work was widely accepted. When you listen to the music, what you will hear is a regular pattern: A, A, B, B, A, C, C, D, D. Every single composition follows that model. Every composition of ragtime music after Joplin had to follow that model. What you will hear is traditional Western harmonies. What you will hear also is a distinct and strong syncopation, which captured some of the rhythms of the African American community. So, in a sense, Joplin, I began to discover, was liberating his own people from the stereotypes in which they were trapped. But I found another form of liberation as well, and that liberation was attached to the many auditors who listened to it. Observers at the time who heard the music or went to concerts would say, you know, when you listen to this music, you can't keep your toe from tapping. You can't keep your head from swaying. People felt the movement. When you went to a concert where it was expected that people would dance, they danced with wild abandon. And so on the one hand, people who were looking to escape from the very prim and proper Victorian ways, and they could be white or black, found in this music an opportunity to express themselves and to release themselves, I think, from the strictures of Victorian culture. At the same time, it was a form of release that critics saw as an abandonment of self-control. They saw this very movement and liberation as evidence of the barbarism that they attached to the music. The other part of the context that mattered was the fact that African Americans after the Civil War, and especially in the 1890s when Scott Joplin began his composing career, were exposed to some of the most virulent violence one can imagine. Lynching and lynch mobs, extra-legal violence. They were oppressed economically, they were oppressed socially, they were segregated from white people, and they had this, and those laws had the sanction of the state. And so with Scott Joplin writing music that put the lie to inequality and suggested that African Americans had the capacity to be equal citizens, that was part of the conflict. And it made me realize that even though I couldn't hear in the music itself, listening to the context, I discovered that Scott Joplin's music was all about social justice. It was all about truth-telling, and it was all about doing the right thing. In fact, his final opera, Treemonisha, was an opera that ended with an educated leader who emerged in a community that had been so deeply depressed, and when she had a chance to take her revenge against white oppressors, instead she said, "We won't do that because wrong is never right." And so even in these very simple words, Scott Joplin suggested that wrong is never right. In order to do this kind of research, I had to be brave enough to cross boundaries. My own work was situated in history, but I found myself reading in the sociology of music, in literature, and in politics in order to make sense of the experience that I was witnessing in the sources. And so to me, being interdisciplinary is part of what makes my work able to address this issue of social justice. For me, the arts call upon us to look for what is beautiful and transcendent. And I think it is that quest for beauty and transcendence that makes us human. And that very desire to find the human and the transcendent means that we are looking for social justice, that all of us should have access to these things. And my work, I believe, helps to advance that cause.